This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we're going deep into World War II.
The Pacific Theater, to be exact.
The Pacific Theater, you've heard of it, obviously, but this isn't just your usual World War II overview.
No, we're going to try to get under the surface here, really understand what made this theater so unique, so unbelievably brutal.
And fair warning, it's going to get pretty intense.
It was a different kind of war than what was happening in Europe. Over there, it was massive land battles, shifting alliances.
Right.
The Pacific was, think island hopping, vast naval battles, these air campaigns stretching across thousands of miles.
And driving this whole thing, at least from Japan's side, was what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere.
Right. Basically, their goal was to control the entire region.
Ambitious.
Now, you say island hopping, and it almost sounds, kind of simple. But picture this. You're trying to take these islands one by one, heavily fortified.
Yeah.
And they're spread out across, huge distances.
So we're talking amphibious landings under constant fire, and then just the logistics of getting supplies to these guys.
Oh, logistical nightmares.
It's makes you think twice about using the phrase island paradise, huh?
It really does.
Right.
And the human cost, just staggering. Just one example, the Battle of Guadalcanal.
Oh, man.
Starts August 1942, rages for 6 months. Over 30,000 Japanese soldiers killed just in that one campaign.
Sets the stage for what we're talking about here. And then you've got to factor in the Japanese fighting spirit itself. I mean, this was unlike anything the U.S. had ever faced.
Yeah, that's where the Bushido Code comes in.
Yeah.
Not just a set of military principles. It was ingrained in their culture.
Yeah.
Honor, loyalty, fighting to the death.
So different from what the U.S. was used to.
Think about it. Surrender was seen as the ultimate dishonor. So very few Japanese soldiers surrendered, even facing overwhelming odds.
Wow.
They were trained to fight to the very end, often resorting to suicidal attacks rather than be captured.
And we see this play out in some of the most brutal battles of the war, right? Iwo Jima and Okinawa.
Exactly. Iwo Jima, February to March 1945, over 6,800 U.S. Marines killed, almost 21,000 Japanese soldiers dead, most of them last stands or suicide missions.
It's just unbelievable.
And then Okinawa, April to June 1945, the final, bloodiest battle of the war. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers, 12,000 American servicemen killed.
Okinawa was, just devastating. And we haven't even talked about the Kamikaze pilots yet.
Oh, right. First appear at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 1944. And they really became this terrifying symbol, not just of Japan's desperation, but their unwavering commitment to this Bushido Code we've been talking about.
Not just isolated incidents. This was a tactic. It makes you think, what's it like facing an enemy so willing to die?
It's a form of psychological warfare, right? Not just about inflicting damage, but about breaking your enemy's will.
Yeah.
Pushing them to their limit.
Okay, so we've got this brutal island hopping, this enemy with a totally different mindset, and, a massive ocean separating the U.S. from its objectives. Anything else making this war particularly challenging?
You're forgetting about logistics. Trying to fight a war thousands of miles from your mainland, across this vast ocean.
Yeah, that sounds logistically difficult.
Logistically nightmarish. Think of the Battle of Midway. Crucial turning point, June 1942, but fought over 3,000 miles from the U.S. coast.
3,000 miles? That's like trying to fight a war on the moon back then.
Basically. Every bullet, every bandage, every gallon of fuel, all of it shipped across this vast distance. And coordinating naval movement, providing air support at such ranges, incredibly complex.
Right, and then let's not forget the actual challenge of those amphibious landings, landing troops on a heavily defended island.
One of the most dangerous aspects of the war. Think about the Battle of Saipan, June 1944, over 14,000 U.S. casualties.
Wow.
Just trying to secure the beachhead.
Staggering. We talked about the Bushido Code, but were there specific Japanese tactics that made them especially tough to fight?
Well, apart from the kamikazes, there were the banzai charges, these mass suicide attacks. Hundreds of soldiers, sometimes even civilians, charging straight at U.S. lines.
That must take a certain level of, desperation. fanaticism.
It's hard to comprehend.
Uh,
It was a real tactic they used.
so, facing all this, how did the U.S. actually start to gain the upper hand by 1945?
Well, it was a long, brutal process, but essentially, they systematically dismantled Japan's war machine. A combination of naval power, air superiority, and just relentless land battles.
Okay, let's break that down. Starting with naval power, what were the key battles that really started to shift the tide?
Two really stand out. Midway, which we touched on, and Leyte Gulf.
Midway, that was June of 42, right?
Yep, and a decisive victory for the U.S. The Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. And those are not just any ships, they were the core of their carrier force.
I mean, talk about a turning point. To think the whole war could have, gone differently based on one battle.
It's really remarkable. And then you have Leyte Gulf, October 1944,
Yeah.
the largest naval battle in history. Over 200,000 naval personnel involved.
Whoa!
Complex engagement, but the result was a decisive American victory. The Japanese Navy was crippled, and crucially, their supply lines to Southeast Asia were cut off.
Okay, so after Leyte Gulf, Japan's Navy is on its knees. But what about the air war? How's that playing out?
Initially, U.S. air power was mostly used for support, protecting ships, aiding landings. But by 44, things start to shift.
Uh-oh. More strategic bombing.
You got it. And this is where a certain bomber entered the picture, changes the whole game. The B-29 Superfortress
Ah, the B-29.
could fly these long-range missions, bomb Japan directly from the Mariana Islands.
Okay, so the B-29 shows up, and then things get really, really serious.
Yeah, you have the firebombing of Tokyo, March 9th and 10th, 1945. Absolutely horrifying event. An estimated 100,000 people killed. And then, of course, the atomic bombs. Hiroshima, August 6th, Nagasaki, August 9th, 1945.
Yeah. Those were obviously a significant and very controversial way to end the war. It's almost impossible to really grasp the scale of the devastation. And of course, their use is still debated, even today. But before we go there, we can't forget the land battles, the island hopping that brought the U.S. closer and closer to Japan. How did those contribute to Japan's eventual defeat?
Well, every island captured was a step closer to the Japanese mainland.
Yeah.
But the cost in human lives was just massive. Okinawa especially was it was a bloodbath, and it really gave everyone a glimpse of what a full-scale invasion of Japan might look like, which, by the way, the U.S. was seriously considering at that point.
Operation Downfall, the
Right.
planned invasion.
Right, and the casualties at Okinawa, I mean, on both sides, they were so high that a lot of people started to really question, like, is a full-scale invasion really the right move here?
Okay, so by July 1945, we're looking at a Japan that's just been systematically dismantled. Their navy's basically gone, their cities are in ruins, their hold on the Pacific is collapsing. But even facing all that, they haven't surrendered. Why?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting, and that's a story for the next part of our deep dive.
All right, listeners, stick with us. We're going to explore that final chapter of the Pacific War and try to understand what ultimately pushed Japan to surrender.
Welcome back, everybody. We left off with Japan basically on the ropes, right? Their military was devastated, cities in ruins, and a U.S. invasion seemed pretty much inevitable.
Yeah.
But it was July 1945, and they still hadn't surrendered.
Yeah, a fascinating period. Really a convergence of events all coming together to push things toward a resolution.
Yeah.
You have the Potsdam Declaration, the Soviet Union entering the war, and of course the atomic bombs.
Okay, let's unpack all of that. Starting with the Potsdam Declaration, what was that all about?
Well, it was issued by the Allied leaders, the U.S., Britain, and China.
On July 26, 1945. And it basically laid out the terms for Japan's surrender, demanded unconditional surrender, and outlined the consequences of refusing.
So a pretty clear ultimatum: surrender or face the music. What was Japan's reaction?
Initially, they rejected it.
Really?
Yeah, they were clinging to this, this hope of a negotiated peace, one that would preserve the emperor and maybe even some of their pre-war empire.
That seems pretty optimistic given their situation.
It does, but there was another factor at play that gave them, I guess, a sliver of hope: the Soviet Union.
Right. The Soviets had been pretty quiet in the Pacific up to this point.
They had their hands full in Europe, defeating Nazi Germany. But remember, at the Yalta Conference earlier that year, Stalin promised Roosevelt that the Soviet Union would join the war against Japan.
Right, 3 months after Germany surrendered.
Exactly, so the clock was ticking.
Yeah.
And Japan was actually, I guess you could say, hoping to use the Soviets as a mediator, someone who could help them negotiate a better peace deal with the U.S.
Interesting strategy. Play the two superpowers off against each other. I'm guessing it didn't quite work out that way.
No. August 8th, 1945, Just 2 days after the bombing of Hiroshima, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan, invades Manchuria.
Oh, wow. Talk about bad timing.
It shattered any illusions they had about a negotiated peace. Now they were facing a two-front war against the two most powerful nations in the world.
And then on top of all of that, you have the atomic bombs, Hiroshima on August 6th, Nagasaki on August 9th. Hard to fathom what that must have been like, for the Japanese leadership, the people on the ground.
The devastation was unlike anything the world had ever seen. I mean, it forced the Japanese leadership to confront a terrifying new reality, this whole new kind of warfare that really threatened their very existence.
So facing the Potsdam Declaration, the Soviet invasion, and the horrors of atomic warfare, Japan finally surrenders.
Yes. August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announces Japan's unconditional surrender in a radio address to the nation.
It's amazing to think about what must have been happening behind the scenes, before that announcement, all the struggles, the debates.
Absolutely. I mean, it wasn't a simple decision. There was significant resistance from within the military, the government. Some factions were actually advocating for a suicidal defense of the home islands, fight to the bitter end.
I mean, it's hard to even imagine given what they had already gone through.
It really speaks to the power of that Bushido code, that deeply ingrained belief that it's better to die fighting than to surrender. But ultimately, cooler heads prevailed. The emperor's decision prevented further bloodshed.
So the war is over, but what about the aftermath? What happens next?
Well, the immediate consequence was the occupation of Japan by Allied forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur.
MacArthur, larger-than-life figure in post-war Japan, basically reshaped Japanese society.
He did. His mandate was to oversee the demilitarization and democratization of Japan. They dismantled the Japanese military, implemented a new constitution, and held war crimes trials.
So a truly radical transformation for a nation so steeped in militarism. And what about the impact on the Pacific region as a whole?
Well, the war had fundamentally reshaped the geopolitical landscape. The U.S. emerged as the dominant power, filling the void left by the decline of European colonial powers. And that actually paved the way for independence movements in places like Indonesia and Vietnam.
So you have this new world order taking shape in the Pacific. What about Japan itself? How do they cope with the aftermath of such a devastating defeat?
Not easily. I mean, they faced enormous challenges, economic ruin, social upheaval, this deep sense of national trauma. But in the midst of all that, they also embarked on this remarkable journey of reconstruction and reinvention.
The Japanese economic miracle. From, the ashes of war to an economic powerhouse. It's a pretty incredible story. But we can't ignore the shadow cast by the atomic bombs. How did those events shape the post-war world?
They ushered in the nuclear age, an era defined by the terrifying possibility of nuclear war. It was a turning point in human history, and its consequences continue to reverberate today.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it? You realize that the war's legacy goes far beyond shifting borders and political alliances. It really touches on the very core of what it means to be human in the face of such destructive power.
It does. The atomic bombs forced the world to confront this new, terrifying reality. It sparked a global arms race as other nations rushed to develop their own nuclear weapons, and it cast this long shadow over the Cold War, the decades-long standoff between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
So you could say that the Pacific War, in a way, it kind of laid the groundwork for the Cold War.
Absolutely. It reshaped global power dynamics, fueled these incredible technological advancements, and introduced this level of existential anxiety that had never been seen before.
And of course, the ethical and moral questions around the atomic bombs are still being debated today.
And there's no easy answer. It forces us to grapple with these really fundamental questions about the nature of war, the limits of acceptable violence, and the potential consequences of our actions.
It's a debate that goes beyond historical analysis, I think. It really forces us to confront our own humanity.
Exactly. The legacy of war isn't just about dates and battles. It's about the enduring moral and ethical dilemmas that they pose.
Okay, so we've covered the lead up to Japan's surrender, the immediate aftermath, the rise of the U.S. as this global superpower, the dawn of the nuclear age. But how have historians interpreted all of this? Are there different schools of thought, on how it all unfolded, its significance?
There are, and that's something we'll dive into in the final part of our deep dive.
All right, listeners, stay tuned, because we're going to examine how historians have tried to make sense of this really complex, really pivotal chapter in world history. All right, welcome back to our deep dive into the Pacific theater of World War II. We've covered a lot of ground. the brutal fighting,
The challenges the U.S. faced.
the surrender, and even, touched on some of those really tough ethical questions surrounding the atomic bombs.
And as we've talked about, it wasn't just a conflict that ended in 1945.
Right, right.
The ripple effects, they're still shaping our world.
Absolutely. So let's talk legacy. What are some of the most significant, long-term consequences of this war?
Well, the Pacific War's legacy it's complicated, multifaceted. You have the geopolitical reshuffling of the entire Pacific region,
Mm.
the incredible economic transformation of Japan,
Right.
and of course, you can't forget the dawn of the nuclear age.
Okay, so let's start with the Pacific region as a whole. How did the war redraw the map, so to speak?
The most dramatic shift, the rise of the United States as the dominant power in the region. The war had really weakened those old European colonial empires like Britain, France, the Netherlands.
Right.
They were already struggling after the war in Europe. Their hold on their Asian colonies was, well, it was loosening.
So in a way, the Pacific War kind of accelerated the end of European colonialism in Asia.
Absolutely. It created this power vacuum, and the U.S. stepped right in. And this had a huge impact on the trajectory of, well, think Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines. All of them gained their independence in the years after the war.
It really makes you think how those independence movements might have played out differently, without the war. And speaking of transformations, what about Japan? How did they go from a defeated nation to, a global economic powerhouse?
One of the most remarkable stories of the 20th century.
Yeah.
The U.S. occupation, led by General MacArthur,
Right.
played a key role. Their goal was to demilitarize and democratize Japan, and they really undertook this radical reshaping of Japanese society.
It's hard to imagine a pacifist Japan after, all that we talked about, their wartime fighting spirit.
It was a huge shift. They dismantled the Japanese military, implemented a new constitution, emphasizing pacifism, democratic principles, and they held war crimes trials to address the atrocities committed during the war. Complete overhaul of their systems.
Wow. A complete makeover for a nation that had been so rooted in militarism. And then, of course, there's the economic miracle.
Yes, the Japanese economic miracle.
Yeah.
One of the most impressive achievements, really, in modern history. With U.S. aid and guidance, they rebuilt their economy, embraced new technologies, new industries, and, well, emerged as a global economic powerhouse.
Amazing. Really a testament to their resilience, their adaptability, hard work. But let's shift gears now to a darker aspect of the war's legacy, the nuclear age.
Yeah, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they weren't just the end of World War II. They were the beginning of something new and terrifying. They ushered in the nuclear age, an era defined by this constant threat of nuclear annihilation.
It's something that still hangs over us today, and those bombings had immediate repercussions, right? I mean, beyond just ending the war.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about it. The use of atomic weapons triggered a global arms race. Other nations, especially the Soviet Union, they rushed to develop their own nuclear capabilities. And this nuclear rivalry, it became a defining characteristic of the Cold War. That decades-long standoff between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, shaping global politics, instilling this deep sense of fear.
So the Pacific War, you could say, it kind of set the stage for the Cold War.
In a lot of ways, yes. Reshaped those global power dynamics, fueled incredible technological advancements, and brought this terrifying element of nuclear weapons into the equation.
And the ethical, moral implications of those bombings, I mean, those are still being debated today.
A debate that goes way beyond historical analysis. It forces us to ask these fundamental questions about the nature of war, the limits of violence, the long-term consequences of our choices, especially when those choices involve that kind of destructive power.
It's a reminder that the legacy of war, I mean, it's not just about political boundaries and economic statistics, right? It's about these profound moral and ethical dilemmas that face all of humanity.
Exactly. And it challenges us to think critically about, the lessons we can learn from the past.
Yeah.
To make sure that we never repeat those horrors.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Pacific Theater, what's the key takeaway? What should we remember about this war, its impact?
The Pacific War was this conflict of just unimaginable brutality and scale. It reshaped the geopolitical map, it brought about the end of European colonialism in Asia, and it ushered in the nuclear age. It left a legacy that is both, I think, terrifying and inspiring.
It's it's complex, it's multifaceted, and it's something that continues to shape our world. The Pacific War reminds us, I think, of the devastating cost of conflict, but also the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of learning from the past so we can build a better future.
And that history, it never really ends. Its echoes, they continue to reverberate, shaping the present, influencing the course of the future.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Pacific theater of World War II. We hope you learned something, gained a deeper understanding of this complex, pivotal chapter in human history.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.